Welcome to our Cultural Talk Story series. My name is Jose Barzola. I'm from the Matsunaga Institute for Peace at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our Cultural Talk Story today will focus on Māori, Ngā Pae Wānanga Hine, learning across many depths of Hine, with Tina Ngata and Dr. Peter Mataira. Thank you for joining us today to sit down at our table to learn about Indigenous communities near and far. We're going to start today's event by, I'll introduce Dr. Peter Mataira, who's an associate professor of social work at Hawaii Pacific University. He earned his doctorate degree in social policy and social work from Massey University, Albany campus in Auckland, New Zealand. He has published widely in the areas of Indigenous health, well-being, and economic justice, with particular emphasis on cultural research methodologies and social innovation and entrepreneurship. His critical and community practice background is in mental and behavioral health, economic sustainability, and working with marginalized Indigenous people. So thank you so much for joining us today. Peter, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Jose. I'm honored to be part of this presentation. I just want to first and foremost greet our guest speaker. Ka tira kamihi kia koe te rangatira, te whananga, Tina. Tēnā te mihi kia koe I runga I te ahutanga o tātou tīpuna, te uri o tūwhaka iriora me Hine rupe, ka nui te ko o te ngākau kia kite kia koe I wanganui kia mātou. Nō reira, ka nui te mihi kia koe, Tina. It's an honor to be with you, to be able to be part of your presentation today. So briefly, to all of those of you who have joined us, thank you for joining us. I just greeted our guest, Tina Ngata, in our language. Briefly connected her to, and I, genealogically, through what we call through our whakapapa. So it's a pleasure to have you, Tina, and I also acknowledged the connections, we have, in a sense, to all of you. I'm really pleased to be here and to have you join us. So without further ado, ka huri kia koe, Tina. I turn it over to you to mihi back.
He mihi anō kia koe E te whanaunga, nā hau kua pōhiri mai kia wau ki tēnei wānanga. O tira kia koutou E te whānau huri nō I te ao, huri nō I te moana nui a kia koutou ngā tini whanaunga te mana o ngā whenua o Hawaii, o ngā tini mautere I te moana nui a kia taino kia koutou ki te motu a honu. Huri nō I te ao, tēnā koutou katoa mai tēnei moko puna a hikurangi maunga a Waiapu awa. Tēnei moko puna te whānawa hinerupe, te whānawa tūwhaki iriora. Mai tēnei pito o te ao whare kahika, he mihi anō kia koutou katoa. Kia ora, and thank you very much, whanaunga, for welcoming me and to Jose and to the Peace Institute in Hawaii for the invite to share some time and share some whakaaro, some thoughts and learnings from our Indigenous space here. And here, where I'm speaking from, is the small centre of our universe called Wharekahika in Kawakawa mai Tawhiti. On the Bay of Kawakawa mai Tawhiti. And so, my mountain is Hikurangi and my river is Waiapu. And I also live here, my home is located on the mountain of Pukeamaru. And so, I'm just really thankful for the opportunity to be sharing some of my experiences very recently and some of the work that I do. So I'm a researcher. And I work in the field of environmental research, but I'm also both as a researcher and in life in general an advocate for Indigenous rights and environmental and human rights as well. And that takes me to many different interesting spaces that I'm really fortunate for, of which this is one. So he mihi anō ki a koe te whanaunga o te rā kia koutou katoa. Thank you for having me.
Kia ora, Tina. Thank you for your greetings to all of us. I just want to acknowledge all of you who have joined us. I see you connecting from all parts of the world, which is exciting. And also to mihi to all of our kaumātua, me e kui e koroma, to all our elders who have joined us. Greetings to you and as well. So Tina, this is a really exciting opportunity for you to be able to share your work, your mahi with us. What really inspired me over the last few months was the actions that were taken by the young people or the rangatahi back in our community on the eastern side of the North Island of New Zealand to actually address the COVID pandemic. And I'd like, if you, you could please share with us what that experience was like and how you as a rangatahi, as young people, took control of that situation and, decided to do what you needed to do to mitigate the spread of COVID and to actually enhance the community's sense of well-being. Can you share that kōrero with us, your story with us?
Okay, so yeah, our heritage here is te whānau Tūwhaki Iriora, the descendants of Tūwhaki Iriora and Hine Rupe, te whānau Hine Rupe, very small area on the eastern tip of Te Ika Maui, the Great Fish of Maui. We're very isolated where we live. So the closest urban centre is now, particularly because of the state of our roads, nearly a 3-hour drive away. We have a very limited level of healthcare access, and we have very particular healthcare health challenges. Well, particular, I don't think it's particularly different to many of our whānau from across Te Moananui-a-Kiwa. Many Indigenous people share a very similar health profile, which is we have very poor respiratory health, and so high levels of asthma and chronic respiratory illness, and a lot of blood pressure, issues with high blood pressure, many disproportionately high level of cancer in our region as well. And so, I mean, all of our health profile essentially read like a tidy list of all of the issues that make somebody very vulnerable to COVID-19 and that would inhibit their recovery as well. And so, as when COVID-19 arrived on our shores, our immediate thoughts were, one, for our elders, and two, for our people in general, in terms of the vulnerability of the health profile, because we've been made vulnerable. Those chronic illnesses, it's no coincidence that those chronic health illnesses are shared across Indigenous nations. Many of them are precipitated through an experience of colonization and poor housing and income that creates a lot of these chronic illnesses and susceptibility. We certainly don't have a genetic disposition to have those kinds of illnesses. And so we were really concerned about the way in which we were made vulnerable to COVID-19 through that health profile. And we're also really cognizant of the history of pandemics in our nation as well. And so we have been hit very hard by pandemics from not long after. I mean, when Cook arrived in 1769, he brought illnesses and pandemics on board the Endeavour that wiped out whole communities across the Moananui-a-Kiwa. And certainly that was the case here in Aotearoa as well. And then from then there were a series of pandemics that took out significant swathes of our population. And in the 20th century, in 1918, we had an influenza pandemic that swept through our nation again, and we had mass graves, and we have a mass grave just down the road from my house where many of our ancestors were buried from the first wave of the influenza in 1918, and we have another mass grave just up the road with our tuakana te whānau Panui. And what happened then was that you know, our people realised that there was political posturing, there were all kinds of colonial racism going on in terms of the response, and then of course there was the isolated nature of where it is that we stay that further inhibited any kind of a response. But you know, the imperial racism was probably the largest factor in not getting any response to us, and we suffered greatly. So when the second wave came by in 1920, our ancestors blocked access to our township. They manned the roads on their horses with shotguns and told people, you will not be coming in here, and told our whānau that lives here, you will not be leaving as well. And so, you know, we wound up doing the same thing. But what's interesting is that we're not with shotguns and horses, but we did wind up putting up checkpoints, and it was a very, I want to say it was a very instinctual response. We actually only found out about our ancestors doing that after we had already made the decision that we were going to put the checkpoints up and screen the people who were coming and going. But it was for the same reasons. There was, you know, colonial racism has continued throughout from that century to this one to create blind spots around what our community needs are. And so certainly there was no consideration given to the way in which we had been made vulnerable and what we considered to be an appropriate response. And so it was a very instinctual decision to put those checkpoints up. It was a decision that was made out of love for our elders and concern for our families, and a knowledge that nobody was going to do that for us, so we had to do it for ourselves. And you know, over time, what I've come to see is that it was a DNA-driven decision, because this was an act that we have done throughout time, protecting our areas and our spaces. Back when we were, you know, when I was my ancestor Hine Rupe, when I was her daughters, when I was her son, when I was in the form of all of my ancestors, we have always taken the stand to protect our places and spaces, and that has also taken the form of our participation in World War I and II, where we have had this deep sense of duty to protect and look after our places and spaces. And so I think that rose to the forefront, that manifested to the surface again when we were challenged by COVID. And so it was, I guess, an affirmation that we found out that our ancestors also specifically did that as a response to influenza in 1920. And that as a result of that, we were one of the only, the second time around when it came back, we were one of the only townships in Aotearoa. There were 2 townships in Aotearoa that were unscathed, Māori township. So, and then we also made sure that our elders were cared for, that they had food provided, that they had firewood, that they were kept warm, that they were kept safe, and that people were either, you know, stopping by as they went past their house to call out to them and make sure that they had everything that they needed, or calling them to have a chat with them to make sure they didn't get muke too lonely or feel too isolated as well. So it was very much a process of internalizing internalizing our response and taking responsibility for as much as possible for the care and well-being of our community.
Thanks, Tina. And to give some context to those of you listening, as Tina's mentioned, so the area that we're talking about is on the eastern side of the North Island, Tairāwhiti area. And the response that was made by the community, or decided, as you say, Tina, as part of the DNA. In doing all of that, there was, you met resistance from the state, from perhaps people who didn't understand, local people didn't understand. Can you share more about how you dealt with that? Because when you're dealing with a crisis or a concern in your community, and you come up against some very, and I think even the police at one stage were quite resistant, or in advising you were committing something illegal. Can you tell us how you responded to that with dignity, I think, and which is what I saw, was a lot of dignity coming from the young people about how they dealt with this.
Yeah, so we were one of the first groups to come out and say that we were going to establish checkpoints into our community, and when we did that, I guess the leading up to that were a number of community hui and community-based discussions, and it was our elders, our kaumātua, who endorsed and were happy for us to do this. And I guess for many of us as rangatahi, as the younger generations, and pakeke, not quite elders yet, but these were people who had been rocks for us as we grew up. They had been our guiding lights. They had been the ones that had provided strength and leadership for us. And so for us to see real fear and concern in their eyes was it really unseated you deep in your heart. It really unseated me to see people who had been my rock all my life be fearful. And so for us, it was an easy decision to say that we wanted to do that. For them, they appreciated it and endorsed it. And that was really the endorsement that we needed, and that we felt was most relevant, was that of our own elders in our space and our community. There are a lot of people that, and the police, the initial response of police is that it's illegal. They made a public statement to that effect, saying that it was illegal. There were many inferences that they would come down on us. And it wasn't just restricted to police. The community and the broader New Zealand community all had their opinions about it. Even some within our own community had their opinions, the broader Ngāti Porou outside of our township community. And certainly council also had their opinions. It was very, you can see the more that the groups had been used and accustomed to having power and control over us, the more adverse they were to what it was that we proposed to do. And so they felt that this was something that was subversive to their decision-making structures, and so they opposed it out the gate. Our response to that was that, we are going to do what we need to do, and that has been endorsed by our elders. And we wanted to invite as many of them as possible to join us in that journey to make sure that it was done. Bring your skills, bring your experience, bring your qualifications in these areas. But nobody is more qualified or experienced or educated in our lived reality, our community, and what works for our place and space than us. So for us, the best response to that was for them to bring their skills and experience to the table and work with us to make sure that what we were going to do, which we were going to do it, was done in the best and safest way possible. That took many meetings. Some of them ended abruptly, but we always came back to the table to keep that conversation going. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about us and our feelings and how, you know, upset we were getting at others. It was, we had a genuine desire to do this, determination to do this, but a desire to do it in the best, safest, most informed way possible. And I think, you know, once the police and council eventually did come around, and they were supportive in the end. And I think also once they saw that we had, you know, huge, overridingly huge community support, both within our own community and in the broader community, that overarchingly there was really strong support for what we were doing. And eventually there were 7 checkpoints within our rohinga, within our tribal, within our nation area. And so I think they realized that it was in everybody's best interests to just try and work together, which eventually they did. And when they did, the police realized the value of our knowledge and our local experience, so that they didn't actually have to stop every single person, because we go, oh, you know, that's uncle, he's opening the dump. Oh, you know, that's auntie over there, she actually has to go and tend to pigs. And it's just 2 blocks down that way, you know, so 2 paddocks down that way. She won't encounter any people, and we can watch her cut. So, you know, they realized the value also of the community knowing us and us knowing the community, and what that brought to the process as well. But yeah, it took a lot of work. But like we always said to them, you know, our bottom line was that it's going to happen. We are going to protect our community as we have done for centuries. And we invite people to come along and join us for that purpose.
I think that's what impressed me the most from my observations, was the love, the aloha or the aroha that was expressed by our young people to those coming through the community, you know, that you weren't necessarily confrontational with them. You were in a sense helping them to understand why you were doing that. So in relation to that, I think people would be interested in what impact that might have had, or what impact that actually did have in terms of the spread of COVID along the eastern coast. Can you share a bit about that, and also tied into that, what are some of the lessons that you learned, you and the community learned, that you could share with people who are listening and dealing with the same situations in their own communities?
Yeah. So we were very determined to make this a positive experience. Our people are policed enough. As Māori, we are over-policed. So we didn't want to turn into what they call the brown crown, or overly, you know, increase the level of policing on our whānau. And we knew that it would, and it did get characterised as a Māori issue, so it's them Maoris trying to be divisive. But the truth of the matter was that this is our responsibility to look after everybody in our community, both Māori and non-Māori, and the elders that we were protecting, that we love deeply as well. Some of them were non-Māori elders. And so it was really very much around us stepping up to our ancestral kaiteki responsibilities, our kia'i responsibilities to our community, to our entire community. And that, you know, included, in order to make it not seem like we were policing, we wanted to make sure that everybody understood what, you know, there was a heavy kind of, I guess, education and information aspect to it. And that included getting information out on COVID to all of our community, and also giving them information, mail outs on what we were doing and why we were doing it, but also providing everybody with information on what COVID meant, because we also have, you know, the digital divide exists here as well, where not everybody has access to a computer or a device, or do they have Wi-Fi or the internet? And we had aunties and uncles who had no idea of what COVID was, or the impacts that it was having around the world. It was very surreal to try and explain to an uncle who has no access to news, doesn't have a television, has no computer, hasn't received that outside world information, just lives at his little whare by the river and goes shopping once a week. Trying to get across to them the enormity that there's this global pandemic and the whole world has gone into shutdown is very surreal for them. And so we had to work within our realities, and the needs of our community to make sure that everybody had that information. And then also we wanted the community to take ownership of it as well. So we made sure that we fed back to the community every night. Okay, we had this many people on the road today, whānau, most of the whānau, we're going to the shop to go and get gas. Just so everybody knows, the shop's out of gas. We won't have gas till next Tuesday anyway. So waste time if that's why you're going on the road. And so we kept, giving people information around that kind of thing, but also, sharing the numbers of the mobility numbers out to a community and getting everybody to take ownership to get that mobility down for different reasons, and for us to work together to find solutions to get that mobility down as well. And so, and that was about getting the community to take ownership of it. So again, it didn't feel too much like, so that this was something that we were all doing together. And us on the checkpoint was just one part of that vision and that goal that we did. And so, in that way, we tried to ensure that it was an act of aroha and understood as an act of aroha, and that we continue to do that. So we, in our area here, Wharekahika and Tararoa, have 0 cases. And we knew, because of the way in which we've been made vulnerable, that if it were to get a hold here, it would spread very fast because we have very low immunity to it. So that was our aim, and we achieved that aim, that we had 0 cases. As a region, the Gisborne region, we had the lowest level of cases, which were 4, all of which recovered. In fact, they were picked up as soon as they came into the region. 4 cases, and they were down the line. So we managed to keep COVID out of our community, which we're very proud of. And for me, it was just a repeat of history, where it worked in 1920, and it worked again for us here as well. And even the mayor and council and police admitted that our success as a region, which was the most successful region at keeping it out in the country, our success as a region came down to the checkpoints. And the way in which we ran the checkpoints which was about keeping everybody informed and engaged in the topic, and our community taking ownership of it.
That's really awesome, Tina. And so the fact that you had the lowest rates of positive tests in the country was really a testament to the actions of you as kaitiaki or kiahi, your protectors. And my question is kind of like, how much of that do you think was really about cultural practice? That, that what we're talking about is, our community, our iwi, our tribe, Ngāti Porou, very strong in our traditional ways. And so it was like this convergence of, the sciences, the epidemiology, and there were people like you and others who were able to translate some of that scientific knowledge into the experience for our elders, like our uncle who lives by the river, who has no clue what's going on, and being able to translate that information. A lot of that is, not only in English, but in Te Reo Māori, in our language. Can you look at some of the things that you did and kind of like, yes, that is our practice. That is our protocol. That is what we do. Like, for example, the kaitiakitanga, which is like, we're protectors and, you know, we will shut down this community. So can you get a little bit about that as cultural?
Sure. I mean, I want to say that, you know, there was a great effort across the board in many places, and even from this government, you know, the New Zealand government in general made some really good calls, made some not so great calls as well, but they made some really, you know, I can't overlook the calls that this government made that made it that little bit easier for us to be able to step into our space and get the outcomes that we did here in Aotearoa as well. And then in the background, you had a number of our own whanaunga, Horiana Irwin and Dale Takitimu, you know, and Mike Smith and Hineka Mako, who were and Deb Packer, who were lobbying heavily in the background to remove the barriers to Māori being able to take the steps and make the moves that we had. So, you know, there was still a lot of those kinds of, you know, you find that in times like this, they fall back into what they know. You know, the council fell back and police fell back into what they knew, which is we will enforce our power structure, our colonial imperial power structure. We will exert control and we will tell you what's the best thing to do. And so, and so that didn't, you know, that's not how we wanted to roll. And so we went ahead and did what we did. But also, I mean, even with the testing, we wound up, rather than waiting for the Ministry of Health to sort out tests, we wound up sorting out a mobile testing unit to come through into our communities and test our communities. And we're also the most tested communities in Aotearoa as well. We had the highest level of test. And our community, our whānau, flocked to the testing station when we got it. And I have to say that again, that's because our whānau, you know, you can't force, you know, our whānau, you can't force our whānau to do anything. We're stubborn. You can't force us to do anything we don't want to do. But because our whānau and our community took ownership of it, because they had been empowered with the information in a way that was meaningful to them, and the work had been, you know, that was again some of the work that was put in by people in the background to translate this into Te Reo Māori and to talk about it in a way that was relevant to our people, to talk about it in terms of its impacts upon our future generations, upon our kaumātua, who are the repositories for our makaranga, for our wisdom and our ways of knowing and being. And so when we talking about it in relation to our history and our sense of duty and protection. So when we contextualized it in those ways that were meaningful to us, those were all reasons why our community took the cause up and were very passionate about it and were very engaged. And so they self-nominated to get tested. As soon as they felt that they had symptoms, they would go into self-isolation, they would declare it, they'd get signs done up for their own houses. And that's something that our, you know, the credit goes back again to our whānau for taking that challenge up. But again, I think that also speaks to, you know, the power of localizing the response. And the power models that rely upon, you know, these imperialist models of a central power hub that just tells everybody else what to do from a great distance, whether that's happening in terms of economy, whether that's happening in terms of how you manage nature, whether that's happening in terms of how you disperse justice or how you make decisions about education. Those imperial models of distance, dictating from a distance, you know, they're really broken models, and in so many different ways. And certainly, I think, you know, my learnings from that experience during COVID was that when you can localize it, make it locally relevant, make it locally contextual, empower yourselves with, you know, our whānau also were very empowered to see that we could step up and make our own local response and have it be effective and have it be celebrated, you know. And so when they see us taking that stand, that makes them feel that they can take that stand as well. So they joined us on that journey. And so those things to me, again, were just reaffirmations of how powerful it is when you indigenize your solution. And when I say indigenize, I mean that as the antithesis to imperialize. When you imperialize a solution, you create a power hub in the distance that will dictate to others. And it will usually be in service of that power hub. It will not be in service of that community. It will channel resource and service a power hub, and that power hub will decide what's in the best interests of everybody else. And it will also make decisions about who to sacrifice. And it will also decide who has the most important interests as well. So that's the imperial model. For us, indigenizing it is the flip of that, is localizing the power and the decision making, making it locally contextual and relevant. And that's what we sought to do, and that's what we saw was very important and effective.
I appreciate that, and also what you're saying about localizing or indigenizing. And I want to talk a little bit more about your work around this, addressing the colonial power structures. But before I go, one of the things that I was, when I asked, about some of the sort of embed the cultural practice that was actualized or put into action or into practice, like the importance of our sacred places, our marae, as a place of, as a sanctuary, as a place where, and those marae that we have, which I mentioned in, Tūwhaka Iriora, where we're both from, those places where we go to, but also connect back to our ancestry and our genealogy. Can you share something about, this idea of the marae being this powerful resource that can activate a community response that really doesn't, no other organization I know that can lay dormant for weeks, and then something like this happens, and within 24 hours, we can feed 1,000 people coming to a celebration or to a funeral.
Yeah, well, yes, and so we see it time and time again. Our marae are our ancestors, and so our marae, yours and mine, Hine Rupe, is our ancestor, and she was famed for feeding the people. She was famed for looking after the people, and we have a saying, Hine Rupe Wahine, Hine Rupe Pōtiki, Hine Rupe Rangatira e, which means she was a female leader, and the vast majority of our marae in Ngāti Porou, where we live, are named after women leaders and women fighters, it talks to her skills and leadership as a wahine, but also that she was the youngest, like Maui, the youngest of the children, and that came with a level of feistiness and responsiveness. And so we talk about mana pōtiki, where we come from as well, which is that special mana that the youngest one in the family has of being feisty and fiery and getting everybody worked up. And then Hine Rupe Rangatira, just her ability to be able to rally people together, to bring people together and to lead them, which is what a rangatira does. They will bring people together and lead them. And so she is our, the whare nui is Hine Rupe, and all of her descendants come together in that space. And one of the common times that we come together are for, weddings, but also tangihanga, when we have people pass away, and we have to move like that. So you will get the call that day that somebody has passed, and within 24 hours, you'll have 1,000 people showing up, and you need to decide how will you feed them all. how will you look after them? If it's particularly if it's a rangatira, somebody who will bring tens of thousands of people from around the country to come and pay their respects. Excuse me, you will have to make some, you know, instant decisions around how are we going to look after that, how are we going to look after the roads, how are we going to manage the amount of people coming through, and how are we going to feed them all, and amongst that, how do we provide and care for the grieving whānau first and foremost, the whānau pani. And give this person a good send-off. And so for that, because of that, that's our lived reality living here on the coast, right? People come home all the time. They've passed away in the cities, they've passed away overseas, as well as being, you know, ones that pass away here. They'll come back here to their home to be farewelled. And so we learn how to mobilize very fast. And I think that came to the forefront during COVID. And also when we do mobilize, it's the wahine who lead that space again as well. It's the women who will make those snap decisions about, right, we need a cow, call that farm, ask them to donate a cow, we'll sort them out with payment later. We need a butcher, we need somebody to go harvest from their mara. Boy, I need you to go drive down to town and get all of this, that and the other thing. And so you become very accustomed to mobilizing fast, and it's the women who really do run the marae as well. The men have their roles. In fact, everybody, that's the other thing, is that everybody has their role on the marae. And whether you're cleaning the toilets or cooking in the kitchen or peeling the potatoes, or you're sitting on the pai as an orator, or you're calling the people into the gate as the paukaranga, all of those roles are important, and everybody understands that all of those roles need to be stepped into. So I think, you know, that was another instinctive response from our community, was that not everybody felt that they needed to be on the checkpoint. Other people stepped into the roles of distributing kai, or doing up the information, or counting the numbers and crunching the data. And so so I think, you know, the skills, you know, we have another saying as well, about the youth who was raised on a marae will be settled in this world. And certainly those who were accustomed to being on the marae, I think we're able to be the most responsive in this space as well. And that for that reason also, you'll find that many marae are also our civil defence centres in Aotearoa, so that not just in the case of COVID, but tsunami threat, when there's been earthquakes, when there's been any large social upheaval, even with the Christchurch massacre, you saw that marae mobilised to provide care and support for communities in their times of need. And so yeah, I think that equipped us really well, but it also explained why the vast majority of the checkpoints and the checkpoint crew were women, were wahine. Many of them were kaiako, actually, teachers. Oh, I can't hear you, Peter, you're muted, I think.
Oh, aroha mai.
Hi.
I was going to say that what you've shared with us are some really important and valuable lessons on how Indigenous cultures and Indigenous knowledges can actually teach mainstream. Like for example, you know, how to actually do good surveillance protection work, you know, and engaging the community. I mean, that's a lesson that you know, in any regional council or politician can learn from. How our marae are good resource mobilizers, how we can do that instantly. I mean, those are lessons for the world, right, that you've shared. And it was so apparent during this time of COVID, when everything was happening in real time. And information sharing, how do you do that? And because, you know, it's about reaching the unreachable. You know, as you know, a lot of our whānau live way up the back of, you know, Waikura Valley. You know, they live in, you know, Ngā Valley, way at the end of the road, and it's like they don't have internet. And how do you outreach to those communities, to those people? And I think this is an example of the amazing work that this little community, this rohe, this tribe did, to do what they needed to do to protect themselves. I kind of wanted you to share some of the other work you're doing as a researcher, and particularly around the work that you've been really involved in around sort of addressing the colonial power structures and how that's evident today, but it has a legacy, it has a history through colonization. And what are some of the responses to dealing with these very insidious types of power systems that influence our lives?
Sure, and insidious, you use exactly the right word, insidious, and so far as many of these power systems, they rely upon a sense of deceit. So they either try to cloak themselves in good intentions, or they try to erase their own nefariousness, I guess, would be one way to describe it. And they try to position themselves as heroes in our worlds. And so, as I said, I think COVID is just one context within which it was proven true that indigenizing and localizing your responses is a really powerful great white saviors, that kind of thing. So it can be a really powerful response to indigenize and localize your responses. And so that's also the area of my research. I just recently published a book called Kia Mau, Resisting Colonial Fictions, which looked at that. And there's, one of my favorite authors is Arundhati Roy. And Arundhati Roy, in a essay that she wrote on how to confront empire, she talked about, how important it is to bring it out into the light and expose it in its ugly nakedness so that it cannot even bear to look at itself, and that we must use all of our tools, all of our tools that we have access to mock it, to deride it, to call it down, and to tell our own stories, to expose it into the sunlight for sanitation, and then to, just like COVID, I guess, to sanitize it with sunlight, and also to refute its own stories, and to tell our stories and our truths. And we must use art, and we must use music, and we must use storytelling, and we must tell our own truths from our own spaces to reconstruct the world, and also to dismantle imperialism. And it's one of the common things that you come across when you talk about particularly imperial and colonial racism, which is an area that I have a lot of work, that I carry out a lot of work in, is that you'll find people, particularly colonizers, will often say, it happened in the past, forget about it. So they acknowledge that it happened, but they really want to skip past talking about it, one thing, and they don't want to acknowledge that it's still happening today. And so and areas where, particularly in relation to the police and local and central government and NGOs as well, it's really important that we have those discussions around where empire is still present. So what did that story look like? First of all, let's have that full discussion. What did empire do? Because we have skipped over it, and at best we acknowledge it's something that happened, but we don't talk about its machinations. And if you don't talk about its machinations, if you don't talk about how it functioned historically and how it morphed over time, then you won't know where its tentacles have reached to today. And so the work that I actually started working in this field when I went to the United Nations quite a few years ago, on a different issue, And when I was at the United Nations Permanent Forum, I heard a lot of people talking about, particularly from Turtle Island, our First Nations brothers and sisters on Great Turtle Island, talking about this thing, the Doctrine of Discovery. And we hadn't heard about it. I hadn't heard about it too much in Aotearoa. But at the time, one of our great leaders, Moana Jackson, had just finished leading a meeting about it at the United Nations. So I was like, well, he's obviously invested in the issue, and the language that was being used around it was that it was the primary driver of all Indigenous dispossession. And I thought, well, that's pretty huge. Then we need to know about it. And my next question was, and so if that's all Indigenous, well, I'm Indigenous. So how does that figure into my dispossession as a Māori? So I started to learn about how it arrived. And of course, it arrived in Aotearoa by virtue of James Cook, who applied the Doctrine of Discovery in making proclamations of discovery in Aotearoa. He made about 7 while he was here the first time. And he did that everywhere he went, across the Moananui-a-Kiwa, and of course in Nootka Sound as well. And so I learned about how it arrived. I learned about how, and then I went back before James Cook to find out, well, how did it come to be? So I learned about, the papal bulls of the 15th century, starting with Dum Diversus, and how it, created this level of entitlement and provided powers for European monarchs and European nations to seek out, to vanquish, to subdue, to conquer, and to commit to perpetual slavery for your profit. And that this idea of hierarchical entitlement to our bodies and to our places was incepted through this process in the mid-15th century. That it also incepted things like the West African slave trade and eventually transatlantic slave trade that displaced tens of millions of our African brothers and sisters, that it was tied up to the creation of the concept of race as well. But also that it created a global economic structure of dispossession where European nations created channeled wealth and channeled resources out of these nations through great acts of injustice, and that created the fat coffers of the European nations and empires, but also that wound up underpinning the growth of our modern economy. So it created systems of debt that are still regulated by international institutions who are governed through economic privilege created out of that system by the same systems of empire. And that still exists today, and that debt is still maintained today, and it still keeps these very resource-rich continents and nations and peoples of those nations oppressed, so that those international institutions, which are flowing with, in reality, Indigenous money, so that it can keep them wealthy and maintain a system of bias, of power bias, very unjust system of power bias. And so, but also, that it went into, obviously, the systems of power around the world and the way in which governments established themselves, the way in which justice systems were established as well. The New Zealand government is a fine example of a system that was established under the Doctrine of Discovery, because it certainly wasn't established under the provisions of our treaty. Otherwise, Māori would be sharing power. And so, and our law system as well wound up, there's a famous court case in the United States legal system called Johnson versus McIntosh that that is seen as kind of the moment in which the Doctrine of Discovery was formalized within the US legal system, and that case was used as a precedent for case law in Aotearoa and was then used to dispossess Māori land here as well. And then, you know, that also extends into academic circles, into our knowledge systems, and it's actually ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it became a social psyche. And so often we talk about, you know, when I'm talking about the Doctrine of Discovery or doing workshops on it, I talk about cannabis laws. So in Aotearoa, cannabis was, as a medicine, was being prescribed up until the 1960s. Actually only stopped being prescribed as medicine, I think, was 1965. And, you know, you had the reefer madness and all of the things that were done, and then eventually the war on drugs and cannabis was brought into that. But there's now significant research out there that supports it as medicinal treatment, but so many people still have it in their head that it is intrinsically evil or wrong based on a set of laws that have been in place for, you know, what, 60 years, 60, 70 years tops. And so if that's the way that a law can impact upon the social psyche and your ideas of good and bad, you know, the dichotomy of good and bad, then imagine the kind of social psyche that can be shaped over 500 years by these laws that said that you have an entitlement to other bodies and other places if they are non-white and non-Christian. And so it really has shaped the way in which we relate to each other, and also shaped the way in which we relate to the planet, to Papatūānuku, to the earth as well. And one of the great scholars, Steve Newcomb, that whose work I adore, and he's been an amazing leader in this space, talks about how, you know, some of our existential crises that we face now as a planet is rooted in the social psyche of imperialism and entitlement. And that, you know, this is something that we really need to expose and bring out into the light, because if you can't identify it, how are you going to address it? If we don't identify how empire works within the United Nations, which is a collection of empires, then how are we going to expose the barriers to achieving the SDGs? You know, many of the drivers of the existential issues that we face, that the SDGs are there to try and, with the best of intentions, I guess, try and ameliorate. You know, the drivers of empire that drive those problems are also present within these institutions that are charged with solving those problems. And so we really need to expose, as Arundhati Roy puts it, bring it out into the light and discuss it, identify it. And for me, again, the antithesis of empire is indigeneity, is local, grounded, indigenous ways of knowing and being. And we have some amazing things to offer into that space as a solution to what we're facing. And so there's a responsibility there, I feel, for us as Indigenous peoples to wānanga, you know, to learn, to go through those many depths of learning, to look at how we have acquired some of these imperialist ideas as well. You know, I've just was reading a story yesterday that absolutely broke my heart, that of ways in which, you know, of a Solomon Islands whānau who I hear in Aotearoa working, they were working here before the lockdown to pick fruit, and they're not allowed to go home. They're being oppressed, they're being kept kind of in a form of modern slavery. They're not getting paid, they're not allowed to go home, they're not allowed to leave their premises, but they're also being blamed for being overstayers. And it was a Māori who was doing that to them. And that was what broke my heart, was that we as Māori were oppressing our own tuakana, our own elders from across the moana. And so we really need to, this is a process for us as well of deep investigation, going through all of those internal levels to understand how are we also perpetuating imperialism in our world, and our responsibility is to transcend that, to reach past that, to the gifts of our indigeneity, the gifts of our indigeneity, and to uphold and uplift that as our goal, you know, and to realize, you know, address the darkness that sits within us and the imperial mindsets that we've acquired, and also to bring up and uplift with the light of our indigeneity, to help transcend those issues as well. So I think in particular for Aotearoa, this is a really important discussion, because we are really bad at talking about our own colonialism and racism. In fact, we project ourselves out into the world. It's a tradition, a New Zealand tradition, to project ourselves as being racially harmonious, to project ourselves as being the good guys. This government in particular is really addicted to positive optics. And so we do a very poor job of bringing our darkness out into the light and addressing it. In New Zealand, you know, we've built an entire economy upon stolen Māori land. We maintain an agricultural and horticultural economy through importing and exploitative labour from across the Pacific. Our economy would fall over if we actually had to pay a living wage to many of these seasonal workers that we import from the Pacific. Again, that same economy is made out of stripping the grounds of places like Banaba in the Pacific, Nauru in the Pacific, who were strip mined for phosphate to be able to fertilize our fields for our famous dairy industry. And now we're stripping the fields of Western Sahara for the same. And so, you know, our entire economy is built out of racist imperialism and maintained through racist imperialism. And we need to be discussing that, you know, in our past as well. We have the issue of blackbirding, where we engaged in slavery, again, and exploitation of our Pacific brothers and sisters. And so, you know, how do we respond to that? Well, I see that when we step into those spaces and we do that, I see that as us acquiring and taking on board in an uncritical sense the divisive tools of empire. Empire divides so that it can control. The empires are the ones that created these false borders that sliced up our ocean into economic zones. And empires are the ones that said that you're Samoa, you're Tonga, you're Māori, and you all don't have anything to do with each other. You're separate nations. But if we reach beyond that, if we transcend those narratives, we know that we are whānau. We know that those are our elders. You know, the Solomon Islands whānau are our elders. Our Hawaii whānau are our elders. They're our elder siblings. And so that's one example, I guess, for me of, you know, to transcend those acts of imperialism, we need to reach beyond that to our traditional Indigenous narratives that inform our connectiveness, that know that the ocean is not a border or a boundary, but a connector and an ancestor.
Kia ora, Tina. Well said. I think I'm looking through some of the responses in the chat line, and I think that there's a lot of affirmation for what you're saying. You know, the idea of, you know, how can you discover something that was never really, you know, it was never really undiscovered, right? It's like, and really excited that you brought up, you know, Steve Newcomb's work as an Indigenous a lawyer who's been studying the doctrine of discovery for such a long time. One of the, sort of adding on to what you're saying, one of the two questions really, or two issues that I think are really relevant, and that is how this ties to what's going on globally with this pandemic. The pandemic means that our human ability to control things, we've that's voided, right? So right now, COVID has purged humanity. Like what we know as capitalism is totally purged, right? It's like you have very wealthy capitalists trying to, revive an economy where the workers are, the people who keep those economies, are concerned about their own lives and the lives of their children. In the United States, this government wants to push all kids back to school in states where they have not controlled COVID, and they want workers to go back so they can continue on, driving this unfair economy. So capitalism is now being critiqued, and our healthcare system is being critiqued, education is being critiqued, how we take care of our environment, and it's done by this stakeholder we have no control over, which is a virus, something we cannot see, and it's forcing us. And I think that's perhaps doing, and tied to what you're saying, is it's pushing us now to reassess. What am I doing? Why am I doing this? And I think the stabilizing and comforting thing in all of this is Indigenous knowledge of what our native peoples around the world have been saying for a long time. If you want to talk about resilience and trauma-informed practice, you just need to look at how have native people survived 500 years of being, subject to the doctrine of discovery, subject to colonial powers. The question, it may be a difficult question to put to you, and maybe it's something we can all reflect on, is, so how do we continue to disrupt these systems, dismantle these systems? Because as we know, no wealthy, rich, powerful person is going to give away their power without a fight. And I think that's something we all struggle with, is how do we not disempower, but depower, right? How do we depower these systems and re-empower those systems and re-enable those systems that have for traditions, for eons, have Indigenous people have held on to, and even now, in the face of what's going on, what you did in Ngāti Porou with protecting community is a lesson to the world on what we need to be getting back to. Can you share with us, and maybe some people have some thoughts about how do we deconstruct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I saw that somebody had mentioned, essential workers, and that is another way in which for Aotearoa, again, we've maintained our economy even through COVID and post-COVID now, through oppressing largely Māori and Pacific Island essential workers who still right now are not being paid a livable wage, and are still not being able to access adequate healthcare or adequate housing. And so, and even with, if we come back to the marae, if we come back to our Indigenous practice, as I said before, every role on the marae is valued. It's you are equally valued when you, and one of the beautiful things when we have a tangihanga is that on the last day or on the evening when they have the tangihanga, before they close the box, the tangihanga is our funeral, and they'll go for 3 to 4 days, and people will be working around the clock over that time, cleaning toilets, cooking, clearing tables, making sure that everybody is warm, making sure that the whānau pani, the grieving family, the orphan family are looked after. And there's this part where everybody, who are all of the workers, have their own time with our loved one who has passed away, and we will welcome them in, call them in, welcome them in, and then they have their own special time, and it's a way of us acknowledging them and all of their work, and then giving them their space to grieve as well. And here for our marae at Hine, at least a couple of times a year, we always try to treat our people who do all of that work, get in massage therapists and get their hair did, and just to honour the work that they do. So, you know, that for me is a system of acknowledging all of the hands that go into looking after our community, and we tried to make sure that we did that as well. We acknowledged and gave poha or offerings to the people who provided us with the land block to put our caravan on for our checkpoint, to the people who lent us their caravan, to the people who did the printing for us, we just always tried to acknowledge everybody through that process. And again, that's a practice that I think is honed and refined from being somebody who's raised with marae practices. You get to understand the importance of acknowledging everybody. And that's something that's really not done within imperialist systems. So even now, through the COVID crisis, you know, you had all of these people ordering things online, and there were all of these brown hands that went into getting that thing to your house. You know, a lot of it was heavily packaged, but also the people, and the fact there are whole factories that still had to keep producing things, and people who were working in slave conditions who are just forgotten about. And even our essential workers, who they called them essential workers, they made these lovely, you know, optics about them and said very nice things, but would not pay them a wage. And so really didn't acknowledge the mana. We did not manaki, we didn't aki their mana, we did not acknowledge their mana in that process. And so even in that COVID response, there was a lot of oppression and dispossession that was carried out through that response as well. And so I think that, you know, those are the kinds of things where our ways of knowing and being and doing really outstrip the colonial practices and imperial practices of knowing and being and doing. And so how do we respond to that? Again, I think, you know, we need to bring that kind of practice out into the light, and we need to respond to it, because yeah, those systems are very powerful, but they're powerful because they control multitudes. And though I say, you know, Steve Biko, he has a saying where he says, you know, the most powerful tool of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And we have to always remember that they are few and we are many, and they rely upon us allowing ourselves to be controlled. And there's so many mechanisms that they create. And when I say that we allow ourselves to be controlled, I'm not talking about the police state, although it's important to talk about the imperialism of police and military as well, and deconstruct and dismantle some of the falsehoods that are placed around these things. And I know particularly when we're talking about militarism with RIMPAC playing out in Hawaii, that there are narratives placed around that of the common good and protection that really need to be dismantled and replaced with the Indigenous truth of what those systems actually represent. Because when it all comes down to it, the power of the state is rooted in militarism. The last card that they will always have to play against us will be the card of military force to bring us to heel. And so those things need to be constantly dismantled, because they are most effective when we believe in them, and when we don't question them, and when we don't challenge them, because we just believe the colonial fiction that it's in our best interests. And so, you know, I think it's super important for us to continue to have these discussions to dismantle imperialism intellectually. And I guess what we've seen with the dismantling of, you know, bringing down statues and the Black Lives, is that is a process where the intellectual dismantling of imperialism has crossed over into physical resistance of just saying, and actually dismantling monuments and saying, no, these monuments represent narratives of imperial oppression, and we will not stand for that anymore. And the way in which, you know, that narrative that cloaks imperialism and that encloaks the crimes of imperialism and winds up justifying the presence of imperialist and oppressive structures comes in the form of education curriculums, and it comes in the form of statues, and it comes in the form of who gets to be on our currency, and it comes in the form of who, you know, who are the heroes in our stories, and what does heroism look like, and what constitutes being a good leader. And so I think, you know, we need to consistently be deconstructing those fictions, and bringing that out into the light in all of its naked ugliness, as Arundhati Roy puts it, so that we can then position that next to Indigenous beauty and sophistication, and make some clear decisions. And I think, you know, you need to do that in order to drive yourself through this, because resistance is exhausting. When you're born into an Indigenous reality, your existence is a form of resistance. When you're born into a space where it says, where the dominant system is saying to you, your best chances of survival is to not survive as an Indigenous person, is to convert fully into the colonial system and assimilate fully, and that will be your best chance of survival. That will be your easiest way of living. You know, existing as an Indigenous person in the way that you present yourself, in the way, the language that you speak, the clothes that you wear, the things that you stand for, all of those things are acts of resistance. And you need to be committed to it in your heart and your mind, or you will not last the distance. And so, you know, you need to understand, this is why it's so important for us to understand the fullness of our story, so that we understand what our due is and what the due of our mokopuna is, so that we understand that our future generations, what they have rights to, to understand what's been taken away from us, so that we understand what they have rights to. And that is what will keep you getting up in the morning. That is what will keep driving you. That's why we are still here, in spite of everything that they have tried to do. That's why we are still here, and we're not going anywhere. And so we have to keep telling those stories. We have to keep highlighting the injustice and our strength and our solutions, so that we can transcend beyond that injustice for us and for humanity.
That's awesome, Tina. I'm aware we have like 10 or so minutes left. I really have one final sort of broad question. But I think what you're saying is so important, so relevant, you know, in terms of, you know, a few years ago, David Corton wrote a book called The Great Turning, and where he was critiquing the empire, and, you know, how that's kind of like, you know, we're in a serious situation. And I think COVID has now pushed that right to the fore, is that if we don't do something about this, the question I have is that, and I've been looking through some of the responses, is some of the chat, is how can we be all inclusive in this great turning of the empire, like as non-Indigenous scholars, researchers, you know, what part do they play? What part do non-Māori or Pākehā academics play? Or you know, how do we collectively work towards that kind of world that we want to see for our children, our mokopuna, our grandchildren?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple answers to that, and I think this is something I meant to touch on in my last answer, which I didn't, but it's relevant to this as well, which is, you know, we now know that pandemics are also linked to our, you know, the anthropogenic. It's got to do with humans impacting upon nature and the way in which we take from nature. And I always think about our story of Rata, and how our ancestor Rata, when he went to build his waka over, and when he was in Hawaii, and he went to build his waka, and he didn't ask for permission, he just took from nature. And then he went back the next day and all of the creatures of the forest had rebuilt the tree. And so he took again. He was like, what? And he took again. And he started to carve his canoe, and then he went home to rest, and then he came back, and they had said nope, and they went back and built the tree again. And so he finally realized that he didn't ask for permission. He didn't go through the proper rituals and ceremonies to ask Tāne for permission and Hine Wāoriki for permission to do what he did. And when he went through those ceremonies, and he was able to complete his task. And that's one of our oldest, most formative, stories gifted to us by our ancestors. It talks about the importance of working with nature and making sure that you don't take, more than what your due is, and to be aware of the impacts of your decisions. And so, I think to modernize that tale, what we see is that nature is, again, whether it's through climate change, which, and as bad as COVID is, it's not an extinction level event. It's terrible. It's horrifying. Climate change is an extinction level event. And so when nature has brought COVID-19 to us, that's almost a shot across the bow compared to what climate change will bring to us, and is already bringing to many of us, and so I think, those are just really important things for us to remember, and because that doesn't just impact us. That's not just about, as we know, COVID-19 is not only hitting Indigenous people, it has a very specific impact for communities of colour and for Indigenous people, but it's not just hitting Indigenous people. Climate change will not just, that's an extinction level event. That's not just extinction of Indigenous peoples. We're just at the forefront of the impacts right now. And so understanding and deconstructing imperialism is something that holds value for all of us, because it's not doing any of us any good. Corporate imperialism in the form of oil extraction and emissions, and in the form of plastic pollution of our ocean, and in the form of the global economy, is something that will ultimately undo all of our realities and deny futures to all of our children and grandchildren, and so on. And so, I think all of us have a vested interest in understanding and putting aside our personal, you really do need to engage in understanding the role of imperialism, not from a personal space, although you will be a better person for it, but understanding that this is about a continuity of rights that exists across time, that this is about us looking after the rights of our future generations as well, and that it's something, and that it's a service that you provide to humanity. So we all need to transcend beyond what we get out of it. You will get something out of it, but you need to transcend beyond getting something out of it, and understand that what imperialism has done to humanity and the planet, and from that space, let that drive your determination to start to understand your role in it, how you might be upholding it. That's for Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and how you can best start to dismantle it within your context and your role, and believe and understand in the benefits that will have for the planet and for your children, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. When we put this, like I said, when we put this checkpoint in place, that was an Indigenous-led response that was also driven by love for our entire community, not just our Māori community. And we wanted to make sure that we protected everybody in that space. And the imperial power structures at the outset would have had us remain vulnerable, the non-Māori as well as the Māori remain vulnerable in that space by denying us those acts. And so for us to dismantle and resist those imperialist voices and suggestions was an act of love for everyone. Mm.
Tēnā koe, tēnā. I think it's a really good place for us to come to rest at, and we're at a time, you know, we could kōrero and talk for much longer, but ka nutimi ki a koutou i te wā nei, Tina, ka motuihi, ka motuihi. Thank you very much for sharing your whakaaro, your thoughts and your vision. I think a lot of people who have listened, and I've been looking, there's people from really all corners of the earth that are listening. I want to acknowledge them as well. All of you who have joined. Really appreciate you, Tina. You know, one of my whanaunga. I'm so proud of you and the work you're doing back home. Nō reira, ka huri kia Jose. I'll pass the time back over to Jose, and we'll catch up with you again, Tina.
For sure. Tēnā koe. Mahalo.
So Jose, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. I can't speak enough words about just everything that has been talked about today. Definitely, Tina, thank you for sharing your story today. For all of us to learn a little bit more about the Māori community and your experience. I appreciate and love your passion to share just the beauty of your heritage. In one of our earlier conversations of prepping for this event, you mentioned, you spoke to me about our stories as it relates to our Indigenous heritage, and it's something that really just stuck with me. And every dialogue I have with you just continues to build upon that. And I just wanted to share that quote with our community here today, which you mentioned, we carry our stories in our DNA and they tend to manifest itself. The quote just continues to resonate with me even more today as I continue to discover my own Indigenous heritage, especially something you just mentioned some time ago about how it transcends beyond our own Indigenous narrative, which I think is so beautifully said and eloquent, because deep down, I think we are so connected in so many different ways. And I appreciate you for, especially, so coming from myself, being an immigrant, I just really spoke to me as I've transcended through different areas of locations. But nonetheless, I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with the Māori community, that even though we may be far away from each other physically, I feel much closer to you after today. I do look forward to staying in touch. Thank you. Also, a warm thank you to Peter for facilitating today's dialogue. Thank you for continuing to be a resilient bridge builder. It's just so natural, the conversation you two had. You can definitely see the wonderful, strong relationship you have there. Last but not least, thank you for all joining today's webinar. We deeply appreciate your interest and support in sitting down at our table to learn about communities, Indigenous communities near and far through our Cultural Talk Story series.